Getting the tilt angle set right on a hospital bed can be difficult. I realize that may sound like a strange way to begin a sermon, but if you visit people in hospitals as often as I have, it's something with which you're confronted on a regular basis. When the bed is too horizontal, it's hard for the patient to navigate a straw for sipping water and taking those tiny pills out of the plastic cup. If the pitch of the bed approaches too nearly a sitting position, your midsection can get uncomfortable from being so compressed. Then there's the challenge of falling asleep in an upright position. But if you lie down too long, fluid can build up in your lungs, and your doctor can hound you about respiratory concerns. Getting the bed just right is tough. And even when you do, regardless of the angle, there's a kind of point of view you're always given from a hospital bed. And perhaps that's the greatest challenge. Or at least it was for Mary that day. When I went to visit her, she couldn't get comfortable either. The tubes going in and out of her body were getting in the way of every move that she made. The nurses were having a hard time managing the prescriptions the doctor was giving her for the pain. You see, just a day earlier, she'd been driving in Nashville when a semi lost control and ran her off the road. The doctors said she was lucky to be alive. She showed me pictures of her car. They weren't exaggerating. We had prayer together, and as I stood to get ready to leave, she looked at me and she said, "You know, the hardest part about lying in this hospital bed is that you see everything differently." She was right, of course. What you see really is dependent upon your point of view. I mean, that's what makes eyewitness testimony so unreliable, right? You can have three people from three different angles watch the same event only to give three different stories about exactly what happened. Or simply come to my house one night, be in time with my children. For Harrison, the Golf Channel's the greatest thing on television to watch. For Clara, it's the most boring thing she's ever seen. It's true in every aspect of our lives if you think about it. Ronald Heifetz suggests this in his book. He writes that good leaders know how to navigate challenges by observing circumstances from different vantage points. He uses a dance as a metaphor. He says that to know what's happening on the dance floor, one must not only be part of the dance, but also go up into the balcony and watch from a distance. What you see from the dance floor is very different than what you see from a bird's eye view. Both vantage points are important. And only in seeing both can anyone really gain any sense of real perspective. While it may be easy for us to devalue the perspective of the synagogue leader in our reading today, I wonder if it's important we not overlook his particular point of view. I mean, he is right, you know. You weren't supposed to work or heal on the Sabbath. That was the rule for the Israelites. And rules are not a bad thing in and of themselves, especially this particular one. After all, a grueling work ethic is hard to break when you've been slaves in Egypt for 400 years. And the only way to change generations of Israelites being shaped by a way of life that knows only work without rest is to mandate from God that you take a break every now and then. I mean, rules aren't aimed at just providing order. Sometimes rules are the only way to help us shake old habits and gain a new perspective. I mean, you know some of these rules, like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution granting women the right to vote. and the Supreme Court ruling to make same-sex marriage a right nationwide. Let's not be too quick to judge this synagogue leader. I think we all would agree that rules most certainly matter. But sometimes we prioritize following these rules to such a degree that we forget the reason for which they were created in the first place. Sometimes we get so caught up in obeying the letter of the law that we forget to interpret the spirit of the law. Sometimes we get so focused on the rules in and of themselves that we can lose sight of each other. Take Glenn as an example. I met him as a part of a jail ministry in a previous congregation. It wasn't easy to see Glenn because, well, first and foremost, he was in jail, and for good reason, mind you, at least initially. He was arrested for an alleged crime, and because he nor anyone else could post bail, he remained there for almost a year, awaiting his trial. Despite his insistence on his innocence, the law is the law, after all. It was the day before his trial, and he was excited because finally, once and for all, his name was going to be cleared. But when his lawyer came to meet with him, there was some good news and some bad news. The good news was that the prosecution had dropped the charges against him. Apparently, there wasn't sufficient evidence for a conviction. The bad news was that a couple of months earlier, Glenn was involved in a dispute with another inmate. Glenn was stabbed with a pencil right above the eye and retaliated with a blow to the head of his attacker, which left the perpetrator with a concussion. While Glenn's original charges were being dropped, the prosecution was now pursuing charges against him for this particular incident that took place in jail. And yet if Glenn had never been in jail for a crime for which there wasn't sufficient evidence, he would have never been in a dispute that now is going to keep him there. I wonder what you see from your point of view. A convict or victim? Justice or injustice? Black or white? Or perhaps some shades of gray? I'm not sure what Jesus sees in our reading this morning, except that it's certainly a different point of view than that of this synagogue leader. Specifically, it's that of this woman who's not been able to stand up straight for 18 years, crippled by a debilitating back problem, forcing her to live bent over. I don't know about you, but I can imagine seeing things from such an angle. Never being able to look anyone in the eye. All you see is the dirt on the ground and the feet of those close by. And if you've ever had back problems yourself, you know it affects the way you see everything. Where you sit, where you stand, where you sleep. No one can fully know this woman's pain. But Jesus does try, which is the reason he reinterprets the law. Notice I didn't say he breaks it or ignores it. He simply reimagines it in light of the circumstances before him. Because you see, he seems to understand that while the law helps us to live our lives better, grace creates life itself. And while certainly the law helps us order our world, mercy is what holds the world together. Jesus understands that the law may push us to care for each other, but it's grace that restores us to each other when we've failed in that law. Don't get me wrong here. I realize this is much easier said than done. Some even call it a slippery slope. You know, deciding when to follow the rules and when to reinterpret them. Which is the reason most of us prefer the black and white to the gray. Or at least Michael certainly did. In fact, he did so knowingly. He sat down in my office and told me so. Actually, we've been doing a series in the church I was serving at the time, very similar to the gender, sexuality, and scripture study we're doing here at the church currently. It had an impact on him, and he wanted to talk with me about it. He said to me, I don't think I can come to church here anymore. I said, is it the study? He said, yes, but not for the reasons you might think. You see, I need a church that's going to give me the answers. And this church, it just causes me to ask too many questions. And he's not alone. Heck, I'd prefer have all the answers too. But then again, that would make me God. And who wants that responsibility? In fact, giving way to gray is almost freeing in a sense, isn't it? It allows us to let go of what we can't understand and trust that God's making sense of it for us. I heard Amber Scora talk about this in an interview recently. She just wrote a book called Leaving the Witness, which describes her journey as a third-generation Jehovah's Witness who leaves the faith. After a series of events in her life, including the loss of her 3-month-old child, she discovers that the rigid answers of her religion were not sufficient for the complex questions with which she was faced. She writes this, "Up to that point, I had so many answers. I had clear answers to all my questions. But when I realized the answers just didn't add up, eventually I learned to accept that there was mystery, that there were things in this life we couldn't understand. And I was faced more maybe than anyone else to find a way to be comfortable in that. Because those things like, say, the love I saw in my son's eyes for me when he was a baby are so inexplicable, so transcendent, that they don't need an answer. They need only be experienced and appreciated. We live in a world of certitude these days, don't we? In which everyone has an answer for everything. You just pick the issue. Immigration, gender, sexuality, race, religion. And we dig our heels in so firmly on these answers that these answers become our own set of personal laws. Perhaps in some cases our rules even become our idols, which we follow with such rigidity we lose sight of the value of a different point of view. In fact, there was a meeting at our children's school just the other day for the Gifted program. And we found out this year the theme for the 5th graders is empathy. They're going to spend the time next year thinking about what it is to place oneself in another person's shoes. I'm pleased to hear this is a priority. I'm just so sorry it's so absent from our world that we have to teach it in our schools. I had an Old Testament professor who captured it best. He said this at the beginning of our first class. You're going to learn a great deal in this class about the Bible. It's going to cause you to question a lot of things. Right and wrong may become less clear. Black and white may look more like shades of gray. All I can say is that whatever choices you make and whatever you come to believe, just always do your best to do no harm. Whether you're bent over or standing up straight, my guess is that Jesus would agree that, my friends, is always the right angle.